Welcome to my watercolor painting channel, where I teach all the essential skills of watercolor and guide you through this beautiful medium. Join me on Patreon to have full access to my growing library of watercolor lessons, which I upload weekly. Link to my Patreon in the description down below. So on today's tutorial, I'm gonna show you how I would paint a simple illustration of bird called Wren sitting on wild strawberries. I had an idea for this illustration for a while, and I was carrying this idea for a couple of months, I would say, and then I decided finally to do it. And I gathered some of the reference pictures that I had from my garden. I had some wild strawberries growing in my garden, so I collected leaves and stems and berries and flowers, and I put them on a flat white surface and I took pictures. That's how I got my reference. And for Wren, I just used several illustrations that I found on Google, and I've used it to create this bird, but you won't have an illustration and reference picture for the whole object, the whole illustration. So here is me showing you how I do sketch for this illustration. So I already placed my bird in the center, so this will be a centered composition, and with my mechanical pencil I am just really playing with the shapes and making as I go along, and I am trying to create a balanced composition of leaves, stems and fruit of wild strawberry that surrounding my little wren. For this video I'm using different type of paper. I usually go for arches, cold press, but here I'm going to be using Hahnemuhle paper, which is absolutely great, and I like how colors looking when I'm using this sort of paper. So I decided to go with this one this time. And as you can see, I am building up my illustration already on a good quality paper. You don't have to do that because you have to be very careful how you place your illustration, how you build up all the shapes with your graphite on the paper, because in some ways you can damage your watercolor paper, which is good quality paper. So I would recommend, if you are still making a sketch, sometimes if you're not very confident, if you are still trying to learn to use different type of paper which is not expensive, and practice then, and then transfer it onto good quality paper. You can't see on this video, but I'm actually looking at the piece of paper that I've just printed out with all the references of wild strawberries that I've got, and I'm just looking and trying to see what shapes of these leaves are suitable for this part of my illustration and how to use them. But I am quite inventive here, and I am trying to play with it as I go along and think how it will look like. Of course, I'm not going for 100% realism. I'm just here on a mission to create a cute but recognizable illustration, where when I mean recognizable, I mean when you look at the illustration you would know that this type of bird is wren and it sits on wild strawberries, because you can identify the size of the berries, you can recognize the leaves and everything. This is like closer to realism, but not 100%. So I am with my pencil working my way through and planning where all the leaves and all the stems are gonna go, so they won't distract you from the main piece on this illustration is my bird. Yeah, so I'm just trying to make sure that I'm building it that way and thinking as I play with it where all the stems gonna go, how it's gonna play on the illustration. Again, itself the word illustration means that you are simply creating a picture that tells the story. So it has to be interesting, it has to be so the eye of the person who will be looking at it will travel through this illustration and notice every single details and everything, all the small bits. So you making it, you need to make sure that you make it interesting for people who's gonna look at it. I'm also keeping in mind the balance, so I'm trying to create an illustration that will be well balanced, so it will be balanced from left side and right side of the bird. So I'm making sure that it's not boring, so it's not like mirrored 100%, but also that the shapes and the heaviness of the parts that's situated on the left side is sort of the same as on the right side, if it makes sense. To create this illustration and to draw it on my good quality paper, I don't use soft pencil. So for this one I'm using HB, and it's sort of harder, I would say, than normal HB, but I still like to use it, and I don't press my pencil too hard on a watercolor paper so I won't damage it. I'm just describing the process that I'm going through with my illustration so you will know. But it's totally up to you how you want to place this illustration and how do you want to paint it. I'm using simple shapes to build my illustration. Again, I don't go into detailed drawing here because I know that I will be able to add all these details using paints. After I finished drawing, I used my rubber and I erased most of it so I can just about to see my illustration. And I am starting with my leaves, and I'm using combination of colors sap green plus raw amber here. And as you can see that I am creating the shape of the leaf, and I also add in some of a darker pigment to some of the sides of our leaves, leaving the center slightly lighter than the rest of the leaf. And then with my brush I will be removing some of the pigments in the middle. But for now I'm moving on to my different leaf, and I'm using again sap green with some raw amber, and I'm also trying to create the shape of a strawberry leaf which has slightly spiky ends at the end of every leaf. And I am using my brush size number 6 here, and I am not using quite a lot of color. It's more watery combination because it's my first layer, so I'm just building the shape of my composition of my illustration, going from one object to another. So I decided that I will paint all my leaves and stems first and then move on to different parts of the illustration. Ideally, for any watercolor illustration, in fact any illustration, you need to have a color palette that you use, and all the colors and all the cold and warm colors need to be cohesive. What it means, it simply means that they will look united, they will look good together. That's the explanation behind that. How to achieve it is simply practice on a piece of paper and compare all the colors, and also color theory comes into play. But what I do sometimes when I need to do an illustration, I print it out, and then I'm just print it out on a small piece of paper, and with my watercolor paints I'm just marking down all the colors that I'm going to be using, and I'm comparing, is this going to look good or not? Just a simple exercise that you can adapt as well. It's just an advice. So at the same time, coming back to my painting, I am using a little bit of Prussian blue mixed with sap green to paint some of the leaves of my strawberry. And I am going to be using mostly all these 3 colors for my leaves, and also for the Other side of strawberry leaves, I will be using some paint grey, but I will tell you more. So I'm starting with sap green mixed with raw amber to paint my leaf, and I'm using brush size number 6, and I'm painting wet on dry here. And then I also pre-mixing some different colors. As you can see, just on the right corner, I'm using a little bit of Payne's grey and Prussian blue just to add into my palette, but then I am using more of a Prussian blue than Payne's grey here, and just in some parts of my leaves I'm adding it. So with my brush I'm mapping where my leaves gonna go, and after that, while it's still wet, I will be adding with the tip of my brush, I will be adding just little spiky ends at the end of every strawberry leaf. After I filled every single leaf with paint and I painted all the edges of the leaf, then I'm pulling some pigment out. So I'm lifting the pigment technique when with the full body of the brush I move with my wet but slightly dried brush, move the paint and water out of the place where I put my paint before. And then I also want to add some coldness to my leaves, so I'm using Prussian blue with a little bit of sap green, and I'm placing it in some areas on my strawberry leaves. So, and I'm doing it wet on wet, so all the leaves are still wet at this point, and as you can see, there is no hard edges in between those paints that I've applied, so that means that was wet. So here I'm swapping to the brush size number 0, and it's a brush from proArte, and I'm using sap green mixed with a little bit of raw amber to paint all the stems, and also I decided to do it so I know where all the stems are coming from, so it will help me in the future not to miss anything. So I'm painting all the wild strawberries, all their stems and all the flower heads where they have small leaves coming out of the head, and I'm using sap green mixed with raw amber. As you can see, I'm carefully placing my hand on the right hand side to minimize risks of smudges, and you can turn your painting any way you want to reduce this risk as well, and I normally do it all the time. It's just because I'm creating videos and it's actually harder to do it, not to confuse you guys. So I'm using raw amber and sap green to paint all the stems and all the small leaves, and some of the smaller leaves that goes just from the head of every flower or every berry. Some of them I made slightly yellowy, so I use more raw amber or yellow ochre. So it just, because when you look at the real wild strawberry, you can see that some of the small leaves were above berry, they already started dying off, so I want to replicate it as well in my work. To paint very thin spiky areas, use a smaller brush or use just the tip of your brush. So here I'm using brush size number 0, but you can use brushes that are even smaller in sizes. It's whatever you feel more comfortable with. I will be painting the same leaves using the same color combination. So for these leaves I'm using raw amber mixed with sap green, and as you can see with my brush size number 6, I'm just mapping where the leaf's gonna go, and it's slightly lighter in the middle of the leaf, and then I am just adding this edgy tops of my leaves, and I am just blending it together with my brush, and then adding more color to the bottom, but it's more on the colder spectrum at the bottom, and then I will be adding more of raw amber to the top of my leaf. I'm also noticing on my reference picture that some of the parts of my leaves are actually colder in color because they're not turned to the sun, so they're naturally on a colder spectrum. So I will be painting them using slightly different color combinations. So for those I will be using Payne's grey mixed with a little bit of sap green. As you may know, watercolor's first layer is very important, as watercolor is translucent, so you can see all the layers through ideally in your work. And a first layer normally created in a very light colors just to map out where everything is and what colors will be used, and also some of the colors used in advance for glazing technique. It's when you will be able to see one color that will be shining through the top layer. So I am creating this first layer and I am mapping out where all the dark bits of the leaves are gonna be, where all the lights coming from, what color combinations that I'm using. So first layer is an ideal layer to practice and map out where everything's gonna be on your illustration. I'm making my way through my leaves and I'm using quite watery mixture of that sap green and Payne's grey to paint some of the strawberry leaves that I've got, and I'm adding all the spiky edges at the edge of my each leaf, and then with my brush I'm pulling and moving all the color from the center of the leaf just to add a highlight to make the center of every leaf a slightly lighter. Here for this illustration I'm not so worried about some of the graphite marks that you can see through even when you apply paint, because I know with other layers I will be able to cover it. But if you're planning or if you're doing a botanical illustration, it's very important to remove most of your graphite out 100%. Almost that it's unseen on the paper, especially when you film. You won't be able to see that effect you have to be going for. But for illustration I just know that even with the third layer I will be able to cover it, so I'm not worried about it too much. So I'm moving on and I'm painting other leaves, and I'm using sap green mixed with raw amber first, and then I'm adding more raw amber to some parts of the leaves, not everywhere. And after some time I will be adding some colder mix of Prussian blue and sap green as well. I'm lifting some of the pigment out in the middle of my leaves, and I'm doing it using my brush size number 6. And what I do, so I with my wet but dried brush I'm collecting it, and then I'm washing it, and then I'm drying it against the tissue, and I'm doing it again if necessary. And when the paper becomes a little bit damper, I also want to drop some of the colder combinations of green, so I'm using Prussian blue with sap green and I'm adding it to some parts of the leaves. As you can see, I've added only to 2 different leaves here with a strawberry, and then also I'm correcting it with my wet but dried brush to move the pigment out of the highlighted area on the leaf. And then I swapped to the brush size number 0 from proArte here to paint some stems to give the color to all the stems which are situated on the left hand side from the bird. To paint stems I'm using sap green with raw amber, but it's more of a greener color combination. And after I painted one line I also like to add a little bit more of pigment, and I am dropping it just in the middle of my stem. And then I'm painting all the small leaves that goes from the head of my berry, and some of them I will be using for some of them I will be using more raw amber to paint, so they will be slightly yellowish, slightly brown in color, and some of them will be still green, so I'm using sap green for that. I have waited here for all my leaves to dry out to then carry on with painting first layer for my bird. So I'm using burnt brown mixed with Payne's grey, and as you can see it's quite watered down combination of colors, so it's quite transparent, and I'm using brush size number 8 to paint my bird. And as you can see, I'm having loads of water on my bird, and then I'm just placing color, and I'm looking at my reference picture that I've got of the wren. Again, I'm making an illustration, so it won't be 100% realistic, but it will have properties of that bird, so you will be able to tell because of the size, the shape, the colors, and some details on the bird that this is wren. So I'm just placing my first layer, and I'm making sure that all the color go nice to all the edges of my drawing, and then I'm adding more of light red mixed with burnt sienna, and I also add this color combination to my wings of my bird. I'm looking at the reference picture next to me of that bird, and I'm looking what colors it actually has on its wings, and I am thinking of what colors I may add to my illustration. So I'm decided that I'm gonna go with Payne's grey with a little of Prussian blue, and as you can see it's quite watered down, and I decided to add it to the belly of my bird, and then I will be swapping to the different brush to collect all the extra water, all the extra paint that I've added to my bird. And also I will be creating nice highlighted areas, and it will add a lot of shape to my bird as well. I'm also waiting for my illustration to go slightly damp to add some more colors, so I will have more control of the paint and all the bleeds. So I pre-mixed some colors, so I'm using a more concentrated mixture of Payne's grey mixed with burnt amber, but it's more Payne's grey on top, and I'm using my slightly smaller brush, so this one is 0 from proArte, and I'm just adding some color to the tail of the bird, and then to parts of the wing and top of my bird. And as you can see, it's already going down, so the color isn't spreading so fast, and which gives you a lot of control. So I'm just placing this color, and then I will be regulating it with my brush, and I will be lifting the pigment. But for now I want to add more darker colors and darker pigments to my bird. So here I'm swapping, and I'm adding only burnt amber to the area next to the eye of the bird. And then I'm moving on to the wing, and I am again using just only burnt amber to paint that, a little bit more of color, and then moving on to the tail. I'm placing all the brush strokes so they will replicate the movement on the wing, on the tail. That's where all the feathers go in, and then I will add a little bit more of burnt amber to the bottom of the wing, and it will be like a lot more have a lot more contrast. And this all I am doing while it's damp. So this is damp right now, and I'm still going on with this paper, and I'm still adding some more pigments to the belly, to the parts, and I decided to use more of a Payne's grey to paint underneath the wing, so add a little bit more of shadow. And then after I finished mapping out all the details on my bird for the second layer, I decided to move some of the paint, but also using the same brush I want to add more of the color. So I am using quite diluted burnt amber, and then I'm using Payne's grey to paint belly and the wing. So you can see that I'm moving all the way across my bird, and I'm doing it all in one go. I left my illustration to dry out and I'm moving on to paint all the wild strawberries. For this I'm going to be using crimson hue mixed with a little bit of permanent rose to get this color, and I'm using brush size number 0, and you can see it's quite watery, and I'm trying to make all the white strawberries to be lighter on the right hand side. So once I've painted, I'm moving with my brush all the extra paint to the left hand side. I'm keeping in mind that all the wild strawberries are round in shape, so I'm making sure that they are sort of darker in the center and they have sort of lighted area around them. So what I'm doing with my brush, I'm then adding some more color, but also with a different brush I will be lifting some pigment around it, so it will add a lot more volume to the to every single strawberry that I've got. I'm simply just filling in every single strawberry with color, and I'm using crimson hue and permanent rose, and you can use a little bit more of cadmium yellow to place on some parts of your strawberry. I'm also adding to the darker side of strawberries more of permanent rose, and I'm allowing it to bleed. And then while it's still damp, with a wet but dry brush, I'm moving color from right to the left, so knowing that the light in my picture comes from the right hand side. I'm using sap green mixed with cadmium yellow to paint some of the wild strawberries that I've got that are not ripe. So there are a number of them on my illustration, and I'm just painting them in one color. As you can see, it's quite, clear. So what I do, and for the properties for this paper, I think that for me it works best if I leave it for a little bit, just for the paint to soak in paper, and then I'm able to move that extra paint from every single strawberry and then add a little bit more of sap green to the shady area of my unripened strawberries, just like that. My red strawberries are still damp, so I'm using this opportunity, and with my wet but dried against tissue brush, I am lifting the pigment from the highlighted area. So I waited till my painting went dry 100%, and it's time to go and add more details to our leaves. So I will be using two different color combinations to paint it. So first one will be sap green mixed with burnt amber, and another one will be Prussian blue mixed with sap green. So I will be separating and painting part of every single leaf. First, as you can see, I'm using my brush size number 6 and I'm painting wet on dry, and I'm sort of painted half of the leaf, and I'm adding more color to one of its ends, and they are a lot more concentrated in color, and my mixture has less water in it, so I'm making sure it goes all the way across one part of the leaf, and then I'm adding some extra color to some of the edges of my leaf, and then pulling all the color one side just to create this nice color combination. I'm deciding here to use a lot more darker color combinations towards the bird to create a better contrast, because the belly of the bird is lighter than the leaf, so I'm deciding to add more of the burnt amber there. And as you can see now, I'm painting all these three half of the leaves simultaneously, so I'm working on all of 3 of those, and I'm moving on with my brush, and while they still wet, I just dropped burnt amber on them, and then I'm moving on to my other leaf, and I'm using the same color combination, burnt amber with sap green, and this is the way I will be painting all my strawberry leaves. And then after I finish with one half and it's dried, I'm gonna be painting the other side. To paint really shadowed areas of the leaves, I'm using Payne's grain mixed with a little bit of Prussian blue, just to paint those really dark parts of the leaves. To do this, I'm using my brush size number 6, but you can totally use brush smaller in size if you feel more comfortable using smaller sizes of the brush to paint these intricate details on the leaves. So yeah, I'm using Payne's grain with a little bit of Prussian blue to paint underneath these shadow areas, and also it gives a lot of contrast, and I am not forgetting to drop a little bit of sap green to make it cohesive, to sort of say that it's not separate leaf, it's still strawberry leaves, so they all have this color in it as well. And then I'm moving on to my top leaf, and I'm using the same combination of Prussian blue with a little bit more of sap green to paint this part of the leaf and then I'm dropping just to the top of that half of the leaf. I'm using a warmer color combination, so I'm using sap green with burnt amber, and at the bottom is Prussian blue with sap green, so it's colder. So that's the principle that I apply. So I'm going to be painting all the leaves half, and then I will be using smaller brush for smaller leaves because it just makes it easier to do so. So I'm using here proArte brush size number 0 to paint this half of the leaves, and when I will come back to the bigger leaves, I will use a bigger brush, but it's totally up to you what size you want to use. It's just a guideline, but you don't have to follow it 100%. As you can see, I'm using a quite watered down combination of that sap green to just mark out where the half of my leaves gonna go, and then gradually I'm adding more and more color, especially towards the edges or one side of the leaf, just to create a nice color combination. And I'm also like to paint it that way that it will include both cold green combination and warm green combination together. It just gives richness to your artwork, I guess, so I like to use it here. And I'm using brush size number 0 here, and as you can see, I turned my painting, and I do, it's just for videos it's sometimes harder to do it, not to confuse everyone what I'm painting. So here I've just turned my painting, and I'm just making sure that my hand won't go into wet area on the picture, so I won't create any smudges or drop any paint. I would like to add some more details and some more color richness to my stems and little leaves. So I'm using my brush size number 00 from proArte. It's quite tiny brush, and I'm using combination of color sap green with Prussian blue just to paint some shadow areas and just to give contrast to some of the leaves and these tiny little leaves that goes from flower head and a berry head as well. So very gently placing it and, you know, trying to make sure that I won't go there with my hand. It's time to add more details and shadows to our bird. So I'm using my brush size number 0 and I'm using a saturated burnt amber mixed with Payne's grey color, and once I painted that line, I'm swapping to my brush size number 6. It will be clean and it will contain some water, and I'm making it smooth. I'm moving my brush and then I'm creating sort of gradient going from that shadow area, and I'm blending it together with the belly of that bird, making it smooth, making it nice, so all the paint will distribute in this area equally. I'm also adding burnt amber mixed with Payne grey to the top of the wing to create this shadow area, and I'm just going to be looking at my reference picture to think where the wing is separates from the main body, where all the shadows go in. So I'm placing my color combination in the shady areas, and once I place them, I with my wet brush go round them and paint the rest of it with water, so that makes them smooth and it creates sort of gradient. But some of the areas like on the wing I want to be looking quite hard, so I won't be adding any water. So I'm just trying to create and paint where all the feathers go in on the main body of my wren. I'm also using color combination of burnt sienna mixed with light red, and I'm adding it to some of the areas underneath the wing and then to the tail, and I'm using my brush size number 6 to do that, and it's less concentrated in color, so it has more water than for previous color combination, but it's still quite saturated in color, and I just love this color combination, how it goes with green colors, and I just love it. So moving on, I will be using this brush size number 6 to add some feathers on my wren, and I will be using quite transparent color combination of burnt amber with Payne's grey, and then after I will be painting some of the bits of these feathers, making these brush strokes just like that. I will be placing more color on top while they still will be wet. As you can see, I'm moving down my bird, and some of the brush strokes are quite transparent, and also I'm keeping in mind that underneath layers and colors are different. There are parts of the bird that remain sort of colder in color and some of them warmer, and I am understanding this. I am placing more of the colder color on top of them, like here on the belly I'm using more of a Payne's grey to paint over it, and I'm working wet on dry, but some areas like underneath the wing is still wet, it's still slightly dry, but that's okay. I actually love this effect that some of the areas will be slightly more bleeding and some of them will be hard and sharp in color. So I am moving on under the wing and I'm using my brush to paint it, and I am also keeping in mind this is a shadow area underneath the wing, so the top of my bird will be lighter, and also the belly and top of the head, and I apply all this knowledge on how I'm going to be applying my brush strokes. Leaving our bird to dry, I am moving on to paint our leaves. I would like to add more details to our leaves, and I'm using simply combination of colors. Burnt amber mixed with sap green, but this color combination is quite watered down. It's our third layer, and as you can see, it's quite transparent, but it also gives a lot of details and make it very recognizable, so you can tell this is a strawberry leaf. Yeah, so I'm placing it all across all my strawberry leaves, and then I use a bit more pigment and I drop it in some areas. I simply use burnt amber or sap green, or both together, or Prussian blue with sap green, just to paint them, and I really like the effect that I had. I'm gonna be using combination of colors Crimson Hue and Cadmium Red to paint top layer of my strawberries. As you can see, I'm using less water and it's a lot more color for this layer. I'm using size number 6 of the brush, and once I apply the color, I'm also making sure that I'm moving that extra color from the right to the left, leaving the highlight so that the right side of the each strawberry is lighter than the left side. And also here on my strawberries, I'm placing just on its own a little bit of cadmium yellow just to some parts of my strawberries. Here just a little close-up how I do it. So I applied all the color to all my strawberries that are red, and then with my brush size number 6, I'm pulling the color, so I'm moving the color with slight application of pressure from right to the left. So as you can see that side, the right side, become a lot lighter than the left side. That's the effect. Once my painting dry again, I'm adding with my brush size number 00 from proArte, using color combination of burnt amber and Payne's grey. I'm adding seeds to every single strawberry I've got. This is a simple illustration, so I don't go for hyper-realism, so I'm just using the dark black color to paint my seeds. However, I'm trying to apply less color so it's more diluted in water on the areas where it's lighter. So on the right hand side of the strawberry, I'm just gonna use a slightly lighter color combination just to show that this is the highlighted area on my strawberry. So at the moment I left it untouched, and then I will be using just a little bit less of the color on those areas. And then I'm also painted the flower, and I'm using just Payne's grey with a little bit of Prussian blue to paint outlines of the flower, and then add a little bit more color just around the flower head. Using my brush size 00 from proArte and using color combination of Payne's grey mixed with a little bit of Prussian blue, I've also painted an eye of my bird, and I left some white paper untouched in the middle. Last bits left for my illustration, so I decided to add a little bit of purple lake mixed with burnt umber to some areas on my bird, and I'm using my brush size number 6, and the paper is wet, so I'm painting wet on dry, and I'm placing it under the beak, on the wing, above the wing, and then a little bit on the bird's belly as well, just to give more interest to my bird. And I also checked this with my reference picture, and this color combination looks good. And I'm just carefully applying those brush strokes, and as you can see, I'm trying to repeat the movement on the birds, how the feathers go on the real bird, and in the same way I'm placing my brush stroke. By the way, the same color combination I've used for my bird's legs, so it's simply purple lake mixed with burnt umber, and I'm using my brush size 0 from proArte to paint bird's legs. So I'm just covering it all evenly, and then with my brush I will be trying to leave highlights in some areas of its legs, and then after that I will let it to dry out and then paint all the details on its legs. So I'm painting wet on dry, so I left those legs to dry out 100%, and then I'm using the same color combination, purple lake mixed with burnt umber, to paint these tiny little details on bird's legs, and I'm using brush size 00 for that. Also adding some details to its beak, I'm just painting nostrils, and I'm using my brush size 00, just a little bit of details, but like I said, I don't go for hyperrealism. I'm also gonna paint shadow underneath, and just add some extra details, so the whole bird will look nice and detailed, but at the same time not too detailed. The last thing I've added, and I thought it was very important, is to add the details on its wings and on the tail, which would be very distinctive for this bird. And as you look at it's not a reference picture but a picture of the wren, you will see that it has a very distinctive pattern on its wings and on the tail. So what I've done, I'm just using some burnt umber and Payne's grey, but it's quite concentrated in color, and I'm trying to replicate the same sort of pattern that I can see on the wing and on the tail, and I think I reached that effect. If you enjoyed watching this video, please like, subscribe and leave me a comment down below. Thank you. If you would like to have access to my other watercolor tutorials, consider subscribing to my Patreon. Link is down below. See you next time. Bye!